Thank you for being here, and we are very cognizant of the fact that this is the last panel before lunch, so we're going to do our best to make it very interesting and dynamic so that you all aren't just sitting about the delicious food that's awaiting us all. This panel needs no introduction, but I'll just quickly run through. We have Senator Mark Kelly, who is a native Arizonan, also a member of the U.S. Merchant Marine and Navy combat pilot, retired. We have Congressman Brendan Boyle from Pennsylvania, now in his 5th term as ranking member of House Budget Committee, and we have Jon Finer, who has a ton of things on his bio, frankly, so I will just say he's a principal national security advisor to President Biden. So thank you all for being here. We have a huge topic right now, and that is deterrence, U.S. deterrence in Asia. And there's so many different ways that we can take this panel today. I will say I'm not planning to take audience questions, but because we only have 40 minutes. Oh, actually, there's nothing on the timer, so we got all the time in the world. I'm not planning to take audience questions. If you have something super burning that you want to ask about, try to grab my attention, and I will call on you. So, and there's apparently a microphone somewhere. So, I want to start with a little bit of news. Oh, now they put the number up here. So, okay, we got 38 minutes and 45 seconds. I want to start with something that I don't think is getting a ton of attention in the U.S. media, despite the fact that it seems like an enormous issue right now. And that is this aggressive Chinese behavior against the Filipino Coast Guard in the South China Sea. We've seen about 20 incidents this year alone. Sailors have been injured, ships have been damaged. Senator, I want to start with you because you're just recently back from the region, including the Philippines.
Right.
What are the leaders in the region saying about this, about what's going on between the Chinese Coast Guard and these merchant vessels and the Filipino Coast Guard?
Right, so about 6 weeks ago, I was in the Philippines meeting with President Marcos, also their national security team, but I made a trip where I also visited Vietnam, South Korea, Japan. In the Philippines, it's an interesting dynamic. So since World War II, after World War II, the Chinese started drawing their 9-dash line. Sometimes it's a 10-dash line, it goes back to 9, and that line goes all the way to cover the Spratly Islands, Scarborough Shoals. Scarborough Shoals is very close to the, it's within the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, the EEZ. I used to drop bombs on Scarborough Shoals in the late 80s, early 90s. We were allowed to do it. We got permission from the Philippines, and the Chinese have built some bases out there. So they have basically said that all this territory, including the Spratlys and other islands, is now Chinese territory. It's about 800 to 1,000 miles from China, where these islands are a few hundred miles, in some cases, from the Philippines or from Malaysia. So we have this conflict where the Chinese have claimed this territory, but it's also claimed by the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan as well. And to stake their claim, they've done some very aggressive actions. Now, the Philippine Navy has a ship out there, a World War II ship called the Sierra Madre, that sits out there on a shoal, and they use it as an outpost. It's a rusting hulk of a ship. And if they can't maintain it, it's probably going to sink in time, but they have to resupply it. The Chinese Coast Guard comes out there and harasses the resupply missions. They'll use water cannons, fire them at the resupply ships, and injure Filipino sailors. Now, the real challenge for us is going to be if they wind up, let's say they wind up killing a Filipino sailor. We have a security agreement with the country of the Philippines that obligates us to defend them if they're attacked by another nation. So this is what we call gray zone conflict. It's not, you wouldn't say it's an act of war, it's just below that, but they're trying to stake their claim to this territory. They've built bases on other shoals in the area that include deep water ports and runways. Intelligence equipment is out there. So this is their strategy to lay claim to the South China Sea, not only for fishing, but also for mineral rights, oil and gas rights. And it is at the point where this could be a real, flashpoint in the South China Sea and result in real conflict. My goal as a United States Senator is to make sure, to the best of my ability to do this, is to make sure we don't get in a conflict with China. That's going to be very costly for us, costly for them. One of the best ways to do that is for the Chinese to continue to understand that if they get in a conflict with us, they're going to lose. And we can maybe later, I don't want to drone on for too long here, but maybe later we could talk a little bit about how do we do that.
No, if you're saying interesting stuff, it's not droning on, so that's cool. It's fine. Jon, Senator Kelly has just laid out why this has been an issue for years in the South China Sea, Scarborough Shoal. But why now? I mean, we've seen this aggressive behavior really tick up in the last few weeks. Why is China doing this now?
Look, as for the why, I think it's a better question addressed to them than to us. I mean, we could articulate theories, but it's a pretty opaque system, and you're probably not going to get a straight answer from Chinese leaders on that either. But I think the important thing is, what are we actually doing about this? And, taking a small step back, we spent a lot of time, and rightly so, in this forum on the kind of burning crises of the moment in Ukraine and in Gaza. But, our president, President Biden, has said the future of the 21st century is going to be written in Asia. And so our job as his team is to make sure that even as we are managing those crises and devoting an appropriate degree of time, energy, and resources to them, we don't take our eye off the ball on what we believe is the most strategically consequential region of the world for the United States, and that's the Indo-Pacific, and these key flashpoints like Second Thomas Shoal, as was just described by Senator Kelly. And so that is why you're seeing us adopt sort of a three-part strategy to this. The first is diplomatic. And while you are right that this issue has not gotten a ton of attention in Washington, I think compared to its relative importance, it is getting a lot of attention in the region, and rightly so. And that's not an accident. Part of what we are doing is working with our Philippine partners to, when the Chinese take these aggressive acts, which we come out immediately and condemn, we are also making sure there's video footage, there's photographs of these things, and that we are going out then into capitals in the region and making sure people are very well aware of what this is and what this isn't, which is basically aggressive acts by the Chinese. And so in March, when there was a significant escalation around Second Thomas Shoal and a lot of interference with these resupply efforts, you saw 23 countries around the world, but with a particular focus on the region, come out and express concern about what China was doing. You would not have seen that several years ago, and it's the result of building a diplomatic foundation. Second part of our strategy is making sure these countries have the capabilities to be able to not necessarily stand up to China on their own. That might be an unrealistic goal, but at least do what they need to do for their own basic security, including these resupply missions. So enhancing the capabilities of our partners. The Congress just appropriated a significant amount of money that we're going to help put towards that effort, which is quite important, just in this most recent supplemental bill. That's part two. And then the third part is our own presence in the region, which we have increased in our own operations, including what we call freedom of navigation operations, to demonstrate that these international waterways are not some Chinese dominion, but they are where commerce should be allowed to flow freely, and that we're going to protect that.
Congressman Boyle, I read about a speech that Senator McCain gave on China in 2017. I think he was in Australia at the time, and in which he said China is a bully who is trying to rewrite the world order. So this is now, that was 7 years ago that we heard Senator McCain talking about this. We still see this bullying behavior by China, this time targeting the Philippine Coast Guard. What can the U.S. do, in your opinion, to deter China's bullying and increasingly aggressive behavior?
Yeah, well, you go back even before that. I think it was exactly 15 years ago that I first heard an incoming administration use the term pivot to Asia. We're still waiting for the full pivot. Obviously, events in Europe keep, as well as the Middle East, keep drawing our attention over there and a bit of the way from Asia. One of the strategies of 2 administrations ago was greater economic interconnectedness with our Pacific allies. I hesitate to use the acronym TPP because some of us who were members of Congress at the time might start dropping on the floor and shaking because of how divisive internally, at least on the Democratic side, that debate was, but not just on the Democratic side, on the Republican side as well. Obviously, the TPP effort went up in flames. Since then, though, and it's gotten less attention, the Biden administration has I won't say resurrected that, but through a new, what they call framework, has brought in about a dozen or so, I think 13 Pacific countries, as a way, it's kind of a variation on the same theme for greater interconnectedness, to make sure it's the United States and Western values that are writing the rules of the road when it comes to the Pacific Rim. And then, of course, I'd also point to things like AUKUS, as well as the recent trilateral meeting of the United States, Japan, and South Korea, which is obviously fraught with all sorts of history to overcome there between the Japanese and the South Koreans. So I do think, actually, between the economic side as well as the defensive side, we are seeing more of essentially coalition building with our allies in the Pacific, and that is the best way to combat the spread of Chinese influence in the region.
Congressman, you mentioned, or I'm sorry, Senator Kelly, you mentioned the Mutual Defense Treaty between the U.S. and the Philippines, which I believe is the longest standing. It's from 1951 between the U.S. and any Asian ally. What happens if China kills one of these Filipino Coast Guard members or sinks one of the boats? Is the U.S. obligated to defend?
We are obligated to come to their defense, and the president would make a decision as to what that means at the time. We hope it doesn't come to this. But there is a real possibility that somebody could get seriously injured or killed out there unless the Chinese, back off. I feel that with the alliances that we've created, we now have a trilateral agreement and meetings, and there's been engagement between not only us and the Philippines, but also with the Japanese, that we're well positioned to be able to deal with this, but we got to continue to send the message, and that's why I really appreciate what the administration has done, coming out very quickly to condemn the Chinese actions there and getting other countries to do the same thing. Our strength is our allies, and we have a bunch in the Western Pacific. I mean, what does China have with regards to allies, right? I mean, they are the main patron of countries that want to terrorize their neighbors. North Korea, Russia, Iran. We have real allies. I couldn't believe our popularity in the region. Often when you go to the embassy, you get the country brief as a member of the United States Senate from the ambassador's team, and we often talk about polling. Like, how does the United States poll in these countries compared to, let's say, China? Our approval rating in the Philippines and in Vietnam is above 90%. I'm not sure our approval rating is above 90% in the United States.
I don't know if it's above 90% in this room, honestly.
You know what polls at 90% in our country? Two things: free money and ice cream.
Yeah.
That's how popular the United States is in the Philippines and in Vietnam right now.
Ice cream.
And we've got to capitalize on this, especially with the Vietnamese. And we've got to, look for more opportunity, economic opportunities to help them. The Chinese have been delivering Vietnam a bad deal, including over 1,000 years of war in the last couple millennium. So the Vietnamese right now, they feel like they're, we're very popular over there. We've got to use opportunities to engage with them economically, and also to the extent that we can help with military engagement. They've got a lot of old Russian hardware, some Chinese hardware. A lot of it doesn't work well. It's hard to maintain. So we're working on building these relationships.
Do you think there's opportunity there for the U.S. to sell them more weapons?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Jon, you mentioned the U.S. presence in the region as a way to deter China. And I wonder if you see U.S. Navy ships escorting, or I guess maybe even U.S. Coast Guard ships escorting Filipino Coast Guard ships for their resupply missions, or even any other way of enhancing U.S. troops in the region to help with this problem in the South China Sea.
Sure, certainly would not rule that out. And I think Senator Kelly made a very important point about our mutual defense treaty, which is that we have come out publicly and also said directly to the Chinese and, of course, to the Philippines to reassure them that that treaty applies throughout the South China Sea to public vessels, to armed forces, to aircraft. Exactly how we would go about coming to their defense is something, for obvious kind of operational reasons, we would leave in private and to our discussions directly with the Philippines, but certainly would not rule out a tactic along the lines that you just described. And I did want to just pick up on something that the congressman said, which I think is quite important. This notion of a pivot, of a rebalance to Asia is something that is obviously always, to some extent, going to be a work in progress, but that we think in this administration we have made a major down payment on achieving. When you look at the fact that for the first time at the head of state level, we have had trilateral meetings with the Japanese and the ROK, a major breakthrough at Camp David. First trilateral meeting on the subject of the Philippines with the Japanese and the Philippines just recently in Washington at a time when the Philippines was under such pressure from the PRC. First quad at the head of state level, the AUKUS agreement, which we've all described and talked about, and how consequential that's going to be to the future of the strategic situation throughout the Indo-Pacific. And on and on and on, all in the context of, again, as I said, trying to manage, and I have a particular sensitivity to this, these major global crises, and not take our eye off the ball in pushing these strategic initiatives forward.
Congressman, I want to ask you, because you're a member of the Taiwan. Did you have a point you wanted to make on that?
No,
Okay.
just trying to say so I could see you.
Oh, yeah. You're a member of the Taiwan caucus. It's another, we're talking about South China Sea, but when we talk about deterrence in the region, Taiwan seems to be one of the biggest issues that we hear about. The idea of the U.S. working to somehow deter Xi Jinping from ultimately an invasion of Taiwan. We have the presidential inauguration coming up in just, I don't even know what day today is. It's in like 2 weeks, May 20th. So how do you think China could respond to this inauguration? Do you think that we could see an increase in their military presence around the island? Are you concerned at all that might lead to some escalation?
Well, first, before we even get to the inauguration, let's not overlook what literally just happened in the last couple of weeks, and that is Congress voted for almost $6 billion, $5.9 billion, for aid from Taiwan. Obviously, the Ukraine aspect of that legislation and the Israel aspect of that legislation both got much more attention, but the Taiwan part was by far the largest, overwhelmingly bipartisan vote. In fact, I think there was only 17 votes in the House against the Taiwan aid. So I would think if you're Xi Jinping or one of his advisors, it would be impressed upon you how bipartisan support for Taiwan is in the U.S. Congress at a time in which it's hard to achieve bipartisanship. So that's number one. Now, number two, moving forward, the reality is, as we've seen more dramatically when it comes to Ukraine, there is an open question, and I want to be careful how I talk about this publicly, but there is a real concern about the extent to which the American public would be prepared to really see the United States committed to Taiwan's self-defense. And I think we have to be intellectually honest about the challenge there. In no way can the United States walk away from Taiwan. I think in many ways we are helped by the fact that for the last 2 years and 2 months, Vladimir Putin has had a far more difficult time than was originally anticipated in Ukraine. We're a long way away from the notion that Kyiv would fall in 72 hours, which was the rhetoric in February of 2 years ago. I think that's a cautionary tale for our friends in Beijing. Nonetheless, despite the current overwhelmingly bipartisan support for Taiwan in the U.S., it would become much more of a challenge as things become less abstract.
I wonder, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I think it's hard to talk about Taiwan without talking about semiconductor chips.
Yeah.
It is the crux of the situation on the island. They manufacture most of the highest quality semiconductor chips in the world that power our economy. I mean, these chips go in everything from your iPhone to your vacuum cleaner to, I saw recently a commercial for a Febreze scented thing you plug into the wall, had a semiconductor chip in it.
Wow.
To the most sophisticated missile systems, fighter airplanes. If we lose access right now to the semiconductor chips on the island of Taiwan, within about a year or two, we would lose 10% of our GDP, is the estimate, just by losing access to those chips. But we're taking some steps. We passed the Chips and Science Act. Chris Camacho over here worked very closely with TSMC, also the former governor, current governor, Congress. We've got all the things in place to start manufacturing those chips here. Here in Arizona, TSMC is already committed to the 3rd factory. They may build as many as 6. Wow. So in next year or the year after, we will be building the best semiconductor chips in the world here in the state of Arizona. So that is an important piece of this. Yeah. And it will figure into an ultimate calculation if a president ever has to make a decision whether or not we come to the defense of Taiwan.
Jon, we often hear from administration officials that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is not inevitable, but the reality is Xi Jinping has made it his legacy, is what he calls the reunification of Taiwan. And so I wonder if you think that the inevitability is more about delaying a possible invasion as opposed to really stopping an invasion. Do you really believe it's inevitable?
Look, I don't think anything's inevitable in foreign relations, and I think to come out and declare that something is definitely going to happen on some timeline, as you often see people say in the context of Taiwan, reflects a degree of overconfidence I'm going to try not to replicate here in terms of what the future will bring. But I will tell you, we have to be ready for it. That's our responsibility. 1, to be ready for it, and 2, to do everything we can to avoid that outcome, which would be a very bad thing, first and foremost for the people in Taiwan, but also for the United States, for the region, and probably for the PRC as well. So how do you avoid that outcome? I mean, obviously deterrence, the subject of this panel, is maybe the number 1 tool that we have at our disposal, and the Taiwan Relations Act guides this administration as it has previous administrations. There's actually been a remarkably consistent bipartisan approach to the issue of Taiwan going back now a number of decades, which is the United States provides defense articles that Taiwan needs to defend itself. That's laid out in statute. We execute that according to the letter. We have also said we stand for the status quo. We do not believe and we will not support efforts by the PRC to change the status quo by force, nor do we support efforts by Taiwan if they were going to go in the direction of unilaterally declaring independence. We think that approach has maintained a degree of stability across the Taiwan Strait now going back decades, and we're going to stick to it, as the president has said a number of times.
So maintaining status quo on both sides is sort of the way to, is the policy going forward here. Okay. Congressman, you're also on the Ukraine caucus. We just heard a little bit about Ukraine. Secretary Blinken was recently in China. We heard from him last night in a fascinating conversation right here on the stage. He talked about one of the reasons that he wanted to go was to discuss China's support for Russia, their ongoing support, which we've seen now for more than a year. And most of that support is going to Russia's military actions in Ukraine. And then this week we heard from DNI saying that China's support for Russia has actually helped tip the war in Russia's favor recently. What can the U.S. actually do to stop China from providing support to Russia for use in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, it shows you first, some of us will rhetorically talk about the current axis between Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing. It shows you it's not just rhetoric. There is actually real substance to that and are working in a coordinated way. That said, however, and I was struck by this when I was at the Munich Security Conference a couple months ago, I think there's a real diversity of viewpoints about the extent to which China is actually helping Russia. Is China helping Russia to win, or are they helping Russia just enough not to lose? And I think that it's one more reason why you've seen the United States and this administration over the last couple of years work to improve the relationship with Beijing versus where it was a few years ago. Because in the end, if we are going to help bring this awful Russian war of aggression in Ukraine to an end, the first thing we can do is help the Ukrainians actually outright win it. But the second thing is that we can work with Beijing in terms of a strategic, perhaps, an ally in this regard as a country that has tremendous influence when it comes to Moscow.
Senator, you were, again, just in the region. Do you think the U.S. needs to take tougher measures to stop China from helping Russia?
Well, I think it's something we could consider at this point. I do agree with the congressman that their support so far is not going to help them get to Kyiv and really take over control of Ukraine. It's allowed them to hang on. From after the invasion in February a couple years ago, this thing went south for the Russians pretty fast. Now, because of our delay in getting Ukraine the support that they've needed, it has allowed them to rearm, rebuild their forces, recruit / conscript more individuals, rebuild their army back, and we've given them we bought them a bunch of time. That's unfortunate. We've got Ukraine, the weapons coming, already, showing up in Poland. It'll get shipped to Ukraine, artillery, shells, rounds for HIMARS, Patriots, everything they need. They'll get F-16 jets soon. So I think we're going to see the tide shift back in the favor of Ukraine. But what could we do? I mean, we have some tools. We've got a hammer that we could use against China if we wanted to, some sanctions on, certain, either individuals or, companies. I mean, those are tools in the toolbox. Those are, tough decisions.
When would be the time to do that, you think?
I think that might be a question for the White House.
Well, luckily, right next to you, we have someone from the White House. What do you think,
Much
Jon?
appreciated. Thank you.
Well, I mean, what do you think when do you think is the time to really to lower the hammer? And then I wonder if you've seen if there's been any indication that China has moved from the quote unquote non-lethal aid to a more lethal aid to Russia.
Yeah, so a few things on this. Won't surprise you. I don't have sanctions announcements to make in this conversation, but I will say we are the ones who have really been ringing the alarm bell about this because we are deeply concerned about the impact that it's having on the battlefield in Ukraine. Because I think we have had quite a high degree of success in building a coalition to try to restrict Russia's access to certainly weapons, but also basic capabilities, inputs to their defense industrial base, with one big exception, which is that China has gone further than certainly we think is appropriate to backfill and support Russia's efforts to scale up its defense industrial base. So what do we do about that? Certainly we have the tools at our disposal that Senator Kelly laid out. A very important aspect of this, and we're working on it in real time as we speak, is that it would need to be a multilateral effort to put pressure on them. The Chinese are deeply concerned about their economic relationship, in particular with our European partners, French, Germans, and others, and so that's why I think you're seeing, and it's not an accident, them increasingly speak out about their concerns about PRC, Russian collaboration, cooperation, that is leading to, frankly, Ukrainian civilians, a loss of life directly from this sort of support. And so we're going to continue to raise that, continue to try to invest our partners in that pressure. To the congressman's point about this access, one country that he could add to it is the DPRK, which is also providing a massive amount of support in real time to Russia. And that support does go in the direction of weapons and lethal assistance. So we've obviously been quite concerned about that. The main takeaway for us on this is that we all need to step up our game on our side of this conflict in terms of what we are willing to provide the Ukrainians. And I think you've seen us take some really consequential decisions about new weapon systems and certainly significant funding decision that came out of Congress just in the last couple of weeks. But it also means getting our own house in order, our own defense industrial base, which we have allowed to languish for far too long. And we are making those investments now, and you will see those investments start to bear fruit later this year and the beginning of next year. That's going to make a big difference as well.
Let me just add on this sanctions point. Not that we've necessarily heard it on this stage, we haven't, but a number of my colleagues in the House, interestingly on both sides of the aisle, will increasingly use Cold War rhetoric or Cold War analogies when it comes to China. Let's take a step back from that, because that might sound nice and sound very macho. You know, during the 45 years or so of the Cold War, from roughly 1945 to November 89 when the Berlin Wall falls down, or December 91 when the Soviet Union dissolves, we had almost no economic relationship whatsoever, no trade with the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact countries. Today with China, they are, whether you're looking at imports or exports, they're one of our three largest trading partners. 42% of our trade is three countries, Canada, Mexico, and China. So we are interconnected in a way, and a complicated way with China, in a way that is night and day from the way we were connected with the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc countries. We have to keep that in mind anytime anyone uses a Cold War analogy or there's a conversation about sanctions. This is far more complicated than the previous 20th century example.
I want to get to North Korea. John, you just mentioned North Korea, and Senator, you were recently on the Korean Peninsula. You know, we see a couple of years ago, if we were sitting up here talking about Asia, it would largely be about North Korea. There was a real concern that the U.S. was going to war with North Korea. It wasn't that long ago, but now we don't really talk about it that much. They're still launching missiles. We still see aggressive behavior from them, but it's just not as much in the news. Meanwhile, North Korea and Russia are getting closer than ever. Talk to us a little bit about your trip to the peninsula. What were some of your takeaways about what North Korea is up to right now?
Well, a couple things, and you know that John mentioned the DPRK sending munitions to Russia for them to use in Ukraine. I don't think folks get the scale of how much was sent. He sent basically 10,000 containers that were filled with artillery shells, other ammunition, combat equipment, stuff to help arm the Russian military. That's a lot of stuff. Now, the positive side is he doesn't have that stuff in North Korea anymore. So maybe it is indicative of his actions or what he's thinking about with regards to South Korea. He has said some really disturbing things lately. He used to talk about reunification with South Korea. Kim Jong-un's rhetoric about South Korea is now that they are just the enemy. No talk about reunification on the peninsula anymore. I'm really concerned about some of the recent advances that they've made. They now have enough material to build about 60 plus nuclear weapons. They're building more every year. The delivery systems that they now have available have been evolving. They've tested their first solid rocket ballistic missile. The importance of having a solid rocket motor as opposed to a conventional rocket engine is in a regular rocket engine you have to fuel it. So we would know, and others would know ahead of time, hey, they're fueling that rocket, that means they're going to launch it. That's not the case with a solid rocket on a ballistic missile. So that is a step that they have made in innovation that is very concerning for me. And then you have, who is this guy? You know, we don't know a lot about Kim Jong-un, even though he's been in power for a long time. We don't have a lot of insight into the country. But we do know he's a megalomaniac who has a lot of nuclear weapons. That's generally not true with other countries. I mean, Putin is a thug. You know, I think as Jack's dad, John McCain, talked about him very eloquently. He's a thug. But I think he's somewhat predictable. And my concern is with Kim Jong-un. He's not a predictable guy. He's got a large portion of his population is starving. It's essentially a crime family that has a country. It is one of my biggest concerns in the region, and we just don't talk about it now so much because of what happened with Ukraine. Also, that when COVID happened, the country just basically shut down. And a lot of the insight that we did have into the country, not really available to us anymore. We hope to get some of that back over time. But multiple nuclear weapons, new delivery systems, and the unpredictability of this individual, it is one of my biggest concerns in the region.
John, what's going on with diplomacy between the U.S. and North Korea? Is there any chance for any kind of talks?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think anytime you're asked a question about North Korea, a good place to start is having the humility to acknowledge this is an extremely hard problem that administrations have wrestled with now going back quite a long time. Different approaches have been tried, more leaning in the direction of diplomacy and negotiation, more hardline, fire and fury rhetoric, softer rhetoric. And the reality is that their nuclear program has continued to almost inexorably march forward. So that's the situation we inherited, and we have taken our own approach, which is predicated on a few things. If you don't think it's a good idea to go to war with North Korea, which we obviously think could be a highly devastating and destabilizing event, then you need to rely on things like deterrence and diplomacy. And so we think we have significantly enhanced our approach deterrence through principally the upgrading of our alliances and the trilateralizing of our alliance with the ROK and the Japanese. And I continue to come back to it because I don't think you can overstate the degree to which it was a signal that was felt, including in Pyongyang, that the president met with the leaders of those two countries at Camp David, and that we are talking with them in more direct and more public ways about our extended deterrence commitments, our nuclear umbrella. That is something that is obviously meant as a deterrent signal, and we're going to continue to stress those things. On diplomacy, I think we have not made a secret of the fact that we have reached out a number of times at a number of levels to try to engage the DPRK in diplomatic conversations. For now, they seem to evince no interest in those conversations. I could speculate as to why that is, a range of reasons. They have been willing to engage the United States in the past. They don't seem interested in doing it now. But in the absence of that, which we cannot totally control, can't make them come to the table, we are going to continue to build up the capabilities of our partners to make sure that we're sending an unmistakable signal that they should not try to draw us into a conflict.
What, Congressman, what do you think? I know this is a tough one, but what do you think China thinks about the relationship between North Korea and Russia, this growing partnership between them? I know that that's a tough question. The Chinese don't return our calls when we ask them, but so I'm going to have to ask you here. What do you, how do you think they view that growing relationship?
Yeah, well, first, I was thinking that given the Hermit Kingdom is hard to assess, perhaps next year for the Sedona Forum, we could have Ambassador Dennis Rodman to speak on a panel about North Korea.
Please let me moderate that panel, please.
Because he might have the best insights when it comes to his buddy Kim Jong-un. But at any rate, that is, I want to. It's hard to answer that question without ridiculously speculating as to what might they think, because there's so many variables there. I just couldn't say.
It's hard to know exactly how much pressure China really can put on North Korea, or how much sway they really have on them at this point, right?
I will just say, kind of what you started off, though, it has totally dropped off from the radar. I can't remember the last time in Congress we even had a foreign affairs hearing or a briefing about North Korea, just because of the other hotspots in the world today. When you compare that, like you pointed out, to 5 years ago and Rocket Man and all of that, it is night and day. To the point that was made earlier by Jon, I visited the DMZ in the summer of 2020, July of 2021, and it is remarkable. There are no North Korean soldiers whatsoever on the DMZ anymore. Whereas before, if you're at the DMZ, they would hold up cameras right in your face to film you and collect intelligence. Yeah. They have just completely disappeared.
They're back.
Oh, they have returned?
Yeah, 6 weeks ago they're back. Yeah, they're
Okay.
there.
Did they take pictures of you?
Yeah, they do. But we take pictures of them. Yeah. One of the things I think that China Xi must be thinking is, what is Kim Jong-un getting for these 10,000 containers of weapons? He's probably getting some money, cash, because they really need cash. The DPRK gets most of their cash from stealing crypto and selling drugs and other illicit activities. That's where most of it comes from. So it must be some cash, but the real worry is, are the Russians going to share some ballistic missile technology with the DPRK? And that should be concerning for China, because I'm pretty confident. I know, we don't want to speculate on these things, but it's also not in China's best interest to have a neighbor that has not only a nuclear arsenal, but a very good system to deliver those nuclear weapons, even against one of their, adversaries. So I would expect that is something that would be concerning for them.
And isn't Vladimir Putin supposed to go to North Korea in the next few weeks or months? They've agreed to. There's also submarine technology that they could be sharing with them.
All kinds of stuff that would be very destabilizing.
Yeah. Jon, I'm going to ask you a question that's totally off topic. Sorry, I know. But last night, Secretary Blinken mentioned with Senator Romney that you were in the room, in the Situation Room, the night of the Iranian strikes on Israel. So I'm sorry, when you get name checked by the Secretary of State, you got to get a question on it. What was going through your mind that night when you guys were, or that afternoon, I guess it really was, when you were watching those strikes? Did you think that it was possible you were watching the beginning of World War III almost? Not to be overly dramatic,
I don't want to go quite that far, but I do actually think your question is not totally off topic, and I'll explain why that is. But first, to directly answer, Look, our first and foremost concern in that moment was that we had an ally under attack, and we were worried about what the impact of that attack would be. And as Secretary Blinken said, the scope and scale of this is almost unprecedented. Even in the Russia-Ukraine war, I cannot think of a single salvo or a single day or a single incident that was of the scope. 300 different munitions fired in a matter of like a couple of hours. And so we knew that we were prepared. You know, we saw this coming. It was signaled. And we knew that we had extraordinary capabilities that we could bring to bear to help defend Israel in this situation. And we knew we had other partners and allies invested in this. But we had never really faced a situation quite like this before. So first and foremost, we were concerned about the potential impact on our friends, on our partner, on our ally. The reason I think this is actually very much an on-topic question, though, is what we demonstrated that night is something that I think is actually unique to the United States, which is the value proposition that other countries see in an alliance with us or in a close partnership and relationship with the United States. I don't think there's another country on earth that could have marshaled the sort of coalition that we did to help defend Israel. And by the way, defend Israel at a pretty controversial time to be defending Israel. And those countries did it anyway and regardless. And they did it with us and to some extent because we worked with them to get to that point. And I think that reality was not lost on other countries in the Middle East, friends, partners, and even adversaries, and also not lost on countries around the world, including in the Indo-Pacific, about what is in it for them to be aligned with us.
Is that the future, you think, of a more integrated air defense system throughout the region?
Certainly something we are working on, have been working on, and I think just demonstrated how important it can be in real time.
That's great. We hit right on the nose, 000. Thank you all so much for that. It was a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.